I want to kind of cram a bunch of stuff into this video, sort of essential points of Kierkegaard's. And those are really what he's getting at in Fear and Trembling and the Sickness Unto Death. Namely, this question of faith. In Fear and Trembling, it's an analysis of faith, remember, from the outside looking in. In Sickness Unto Death, he's thinking of faith as a kind of either-or choice, a leap between faith and despair, and the human condition being one of constantly having on the front burner and this thing pressing on you, this question and decision that you have to make regarding faith or despair. Remember, for Heidegger, our own being is this burden that we have to work out and figure out and choose. And he got that from Kierkegaard, but Kierkegaard, it's a little more nuanced. It's not just that we have our being to make any which way we choose. Like Sartre says, I can do whatever I want to do. I can be anything. For Kierkegaard, it's very different. We have to choose to be a self or to not be a self, but we have to choose whether or not we do that in faith or without faith. And so Kierkegaard will go through the different ways in which the human life progresses on these stages, and constantly is confronted with the question of faith in a different register along those stages. Okay, so I want to end Fear and Trembling here, move into Kierkegaard's idea of the three stages of life, because that'll help frame Sickness Unto Death. So we'll move into Sickness Unto Death before we get to Works of Love. So at the end, we were talking about faith as this, we can now say faith for Kierkegaard is a leap, it's a transition. And why does he say leap? Well, he says leap because it's not something we can understand. It's just something that's spontaneous. It looks like it happens spontaneously. There's nothing to explain it rationally. You can't put it in a causal nexus. You can't explain it by something else. You can't say, this is faith and this is why he or she had faith. This is why Abraham did it. This is why this happened, right? Because then that would be to universalize it, to take it and to make it understandable, to put it into a causal nexus, to understand it, to ground it upon something else. Remember, in German, and I think probably Danish too, they're similar, the word for cause in German is grund, to ground something. You put something on a foundation. That is, for Kierkegaard, you go beyond faith, and that's precisely what he's trying not to do. So, for Kierkegaard, faith is, as he puts at the very end, a teleological suspension of the ethical. The teleological suspension. You could even say a teleological suspension of rationality. Why does he say the ethical? Well, we have to think of it in terms of the stages of life, but just in general, think of the ethical in this sense. How else do you understand moral decisions, right? What could possibly trump morality, right? Here Abraham is offering, God tells Abraham to offer his own son, and Abraham does it. And Kierkegaard argues that the single individual is put it higher than the universal, or teleologically suspends that universal, or teleologically suspends that rationality or that morality, okay? And that, we said, I think I said this in a Zoom lecture, that's the same for Kant as sin. That's the same for Kant as sin. Why? Because remember, for Kant, and Kierkegaard would have known this, you act according to the categorical imperative. That is, you never act unless you can will that your maxim be a universal for all. All right? In other words, you universalize everything. If everybody can't do it, then it's wrong. Sin, for Kant, is precisely when you put yourself above what everybody should do, right? I'm saying I'm the exception. That's precisely what faith does. And that's why faith is absurd. It's an absurdity. It's this passion. It cannot be understood. It's teleologically suspending rationality. Okay, now, transition that into what he's talking about in The Sickness Unto Death. Faith is, for him, something that has no explanation why you do it. You start going through these phases in life. Okay, what are these phases? Well, for Kierkegaard, he says in the beginning of the book, what is the self? The self is this synthesis, this synthesis of spirit. What's spirit? It's a self's relationship to itself, and the self's relating itself to itself in the relation. In other words, the self divides itself from itself and has to figure out what the self is, okay? And the self is constantly tasked with the project of making a self. But that task is also coupled with, will you do that in faith, or will you do that by yourself and in despair? And Kierkegaard divides The Sickness Unto Death into two main ways of making a self. Wanting to be a self and not wanting to be a self. Not wanting to be a self and wanting to be a self. He says most of us are in existence in one of these two spheres. We want to be a self, we're being deliberate about making ourselves, or we're ignoring the whole process altogether. Now, the lower stages in life, you're not even aware that you have yourself as a task. As you go through these higher stages in life, you start to recognize yourself as task and actually think you can begin to construct yourself as task, right? Now, where this ends for Kierkegaard is the recognition of the impossibility of making a self. That's where faith comes in. All right, trying to think all of this together. How do we do this? Okay, so let's move backwards. The sickness unto death is all about making a self. And the problem of making a self has the problem of faith and despair, right? This question about what we do with our existence. What's the point of my existence? Who am I? How do I make a self? This burden of being that's felt in anxiety and felt in despair. By the way, he says psychologically, we feel this burden in anxiety. Spiritually, we feel it as despair. Okay, so we're tasked with making a self. And we like to shrug off this burden. It's like when Heidegger said, or we like to shrug off this task. It's like when Heidegger said, Dasein is the only being that has its being to be, and it flees that very possibility. That's precisely what Kierkegaard is talking about here. And the way in which that self is made is ultimately inexplicable. And he's gonna try to explain this, pun intended. He's going to try to explain why this is unexplainable by saying that he's philosophizing out of Christianity as opposed to Greek metaphysics.